And so just a little bit about Citizens Caring for the Future. Citizens Caring for the Future was actually born out of an immersion retreat like the one that we will be discussing today. And this immersion retreat took place in the fall of 2019 and was led by New Mexico El Paso region, Interfaith Power and Light. Ruth, you might have been there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Ruth was actually there. I was not. I'll discuss that in a minute. I did not know about any of this at that point in time. But it was led by New Mexico El Paso region, Interfaith Power and Light, and then also Earthworks as well was there. And during that immersion retreat, Sister Joan organized some faith leaders from Carlsbad mainly. I don't believe there was any faith leaders from Hobbs at the time. And they had a forum where they spoke about just their experience being in the Permian Basin, specifically since the Permian oil boom had started. So 2018, 2019. And at that point in time, it was even more active than it is now. You could really tell a huge difference in our community, but it also was brand new. So folks had a lot to talk about. Those faith leaders had a lot to talk about and a lot of concerns. And in hearing one another, they realized that, oh my gosh, I'm not the only person with these concerns. As I said, it was all kind of new. And so we all had these questions and things that we were noticing, but we didn't know that other people were seeing them. So much of the focus here is drill, baby, drill. And, it's good for the economy, things like that. But in hearing one another, they decided, you know what, we actually need an advocacy group that's making sure we're protected during this oil boom and that's looking out for future generations and making sure that climate change is, as controlled, or climate change is addressed, and that we do our part here in the Permian Basin to control our emissions and things like that that are contributing to climate change. And so that's how Citizens Caring for the Future kind of came to be, with a lot of help from Interfaith Power and Light and a lot of help from Earthworks. Earthworks is not quite as involved with us anymore. It's mainly Interfaith Power and Light that's working closely with Citizens Caring for the Future. But that's just a little bit of background on the organization. A little background on me. I was born and raised in Carlsbad, and I left home in 2011, and I moved back in 2018. And that's when the Permian oil boom was really, really taking off, and it was in full swing, for lack of a better word. And, I noticed the changes to our community, things like, a huge influx of population. All of a sudden there was traffic in Carlsbad, New Mexico, which was kind of crazy. There was daily car wrecks on the highways out in the oil field. At that time, there was a saying called "Stay Alive" on 285. And that's because that highway was so dangerous. There was, daily fatal car wrecks, and you just wouldn't hear about it a lot of the time because it's oil field workers that are transient. Their families are in Louisiana, Mexico, wherever they may be. And so, these deaths didn't get a lot of attention. Things like that were happening. Cost of housing was astronomical at the time. We had teacher shortages before. I feel like everyone else in the country has teacher shortages now, but that was before before everyone else had those as well. So I was noticing those normal things in the community. But then within about a year of being back, I began to notice that I was hearing of a lot of young and relatively young people being diagnosed with rare and aggressive cancers. And then a good friend of mine at 23 was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive cancer. He's doing well now, but it was a type of cancer that should be much less aggressive than it was. And then my own mother at the age of 50 was diagnosed with ovarian cancer with no family history, nothing prior. And that's a relatively young age to be diagnosed with things like that. So just because of all the different health issues I was seeing, I began to think that environmental factors might have been at play. And I didn't really know where to turn. I went to a community meeting the New Mexico Environment Department went on about their produced water rule, things like that. But that's all I could really find. I didn't know about the literature that linked health issues to oil and gas production. I didn't know any of those things. Then the pandemic happened and I didn't think about it for a while. Oil and gas went down for a long time. We were focusing on that, focusing on the pandemic, focusing on COVID. And then after the 2020 election, about 2 weeks after that, one of the Citizens Caring for the Future leaders, he got in touch with me, and he had met me kind of through the election process and said, there's this woman from Earthworks coming to town, and she looks at oil and gas sites, and you can see the pollution through her video camera that does thermography. And I was wondering if you would want to see that. And I said, sure. So I met these two people on the side of the highway that I had never met before to go look at these oil and gas sites. And they said, well, we're going to stop by some folks' house before we head out. And that was Penny and Dia Coyne. And you all have probably heard their story. They were the folks that had the produced water line across from their house burst in January of 2020. It showered their house with radioactive wastewater. They ended up having to put chickens down, a lot of their animals down, and they ultimately settled with a company and ended up moving. And I had just read their story about 2 weeks prior, I want to say in Source Magazine, a local New Mexico publication. And I remember thinking, oh, this is incredible. I didn't know there was people here speaking out about these things. And that day I actually got to meet them. So that was really neat. And then in my time with them, with Natalie at Earthworks and the Citizens Caring for the Future leader, Denton, I learned about Citizens Caring for the Future, which I didn't know existed. And I immediately got involved, and then a few months later became the community organizer. So just a little bit of background on Citizens Caring for the Future. I am amazed by the folks that started it. As I mentioned, the politics here can be a little dicey, and they really stood up at a time when it wasn't easy. And so I'm forever grateful to them for that. But just to give everyone a little small overview, very meta overview about the Permian. So as I mentioned, during the pandemic, oil production did go down in the Permian. We are back up. We are still not to those same 2018, 2019 numbers, but you can see production rising again. You can drive down the highway, see, 10 to 20, lots of rigs, 10 to 20 rigs, things like that. But there are some differences in what we're seeing now. So we here in the Permian are not seeing quite the influx of people that we did in 2018, 2019. We still have quite a bit of population growth, but it's not the same. There isn't quite as much lack of housing. The man camps aren't as filled up. So that's something all of us are kind of speculating on, like, why is that the case that these jobs haven't come back in the same way? We think it's because, a lot of the infrastructure is already up. It's not as new as it was. So it's a little bit easier for the oil and gas companies to bring stuff online. A lot of these companies are practicing capital discipline, so they're not doing as much as production as they possibly could be. And then also automation. So those are just kind of some of the things we're thinking, but it is up and it is also slightly different. So the first boom in 2018, 2019, that was really in between Hobbs and Carlsbad more than anything, out into Texas is where that boom was taking place. And that was in a petroleum basin. So the Permian Basin is comprised of a lot of different basins. That's just the overarching name that we use for the whole region. And so the petroleum basin was particularly active in 2018, 2019. There's still a lot of production there, but now because of the war in Ukraine and the demand for liquefied natural gas, the cost of liquefied natural gas has risen quite a bit. And so now the basins that are predominantly gas basins are a lot more active. And so there's one called the Indian Basin, and that is actually on the other side of Carlsbad, north towards the Artesia area. So we do have production in new places where there wasn't that kind of production, and it's kind of surrounding us from all sides now. And because of the liquefied natural gas being so expensive, that's why you're also seeing places like Valencia County being, looked at for oil and gas production right now too, because that is a gas basin. So just a little bit about that. Also, we likely will have production here in the Permian Basin for a decade to come, years to come. The Inflation Reduction Act has, locked us in to oil and gas leasing for the foreseeable future. That will definitely impact the New Mexico side of the Permian because we are the most active oil and gas basin in the United States. But then also because in New Mexico, a lot of the Permian Basin is public land. So that's why it will have a big impact in this particular region. In the past 5 years, we have seen a lot of growth towards our towns in the Permian. A lot of it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's now encroaching on the communities here. So I'm going to talk about a thing called the oil and gas threat map, and Ruth is probably going to pull that up for me. And so what the oil and gas threat map is it is a map that shows oil and gas sites with a half-mile radius circled around them. And that half-mile radius will show you schools, houses that are nearby. And that matters because a half-mile radius around an oil and gas site is what we call a threat zone. And a threat zone is a place where people living nearby are exposed to high levels of air pollution. So particularly VOCs, like benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, xylene, things like that. And based on peer-reviewed studies, this puts you at a increased risk for negative health impacts. So you can still have the negative health impacts if your home is, you know, farther than a half a mile, or if it's closer than a half a mile. But that's where there's the most peer-reviewed literature that there's significant health impacts. And so in Eddy County specifically, within the past 5 years, so they update this every 5 years. The newest threat map came out in 2022, but within the time that 2017 to 2022, you saw a 40% increase in Eddy County of folks living in an oil and gas threat zone. And in Lee County, you saw a 17% increase of folks living in an oil and gas threat zone. So production is really encroaching and having more and more of an impact on the folks living down here. And that can be quite hard. And so during this immersion retreat that Anne, Ruth, and Clara came to, we met with some folks in Hobbs with a group called Somos Un Pueblo Unido. And Somos Un Pueblo Unido is an advocacy group, if you're not familiar. They mainly work on immigration issues and helping people coming up from South America to obtain citizenship. And so they have a lot of oil and gas workers that they work with, things like that. And so we had a meeting with them when they got into town, and we went over the oil and gas threat map, and we were able to, you know, put in their addresses, things like that. Every single person we spoke with lived within an oil and gas threat zone in Lee County. Lee County has a lot of folks living in an oil and gas threat zone. I think actually more than Carlsbad. They don't have quite as stringent setback rules there. And you can see, as you can see, Ruth is showing you, there's quite a bit of schools that are within a half mile of an oil and gas site in Hobbs, in Lee County, also in Eddy County as well. Ruth, if you want to, I'm actually going to share my screen now and show some pictures. So kind of, as I mentioned, let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So as I mentioned, we met with these folks from Somos Un Pueblo Unido. Here is a picture of everyone. This is Gladys, Maria, and Elavijes. And as I said, they all, when I pulled up the oil and gas threat map, wanted to put their address in, and they all happen to live within an oil and gas threat zone. Gladys, well, actually, Elavijes told us about her sister-in-law, Alma, who she said she lives within a half mile of an oil and gas site. And we actually went to her house, and she came out, and we were able to meet with her. And she has had thyroid cancer, which these pollutants that are emitted from oil and gas sites are known endocrine disruptors, known carcinogens, things like that. So thyroid cancer is probably linked to what she is living by. And a lot of folks on her street as well have dealt with cancers. She said there was a young man on her street that died of a rare and aggressive brain cancer. But I was just going to show you all a little bit of her home. So this is the back side of Alma's home. And her back porch comes right up to this, all this oil and gas infrastructure right here. You see the danger signs, you know, dangerous chemicals, things like that. And then on the front side, this is on the front side of her home. So this is from just looking out her front door. We have Flat Stanley, just sorry about that. That's we're gonna do some kind of campaign with Flat Stanley. So that's why he's in the picture. But so, you know, you have an oil and gas rig that you can see all the infrastructure right there that would be emitting things like methane, a known planet warming gas, but then also the other ones that are associated with oil and gas production, benzene, ethylbenzene, those are the ones that are really dangerous to humans. So that's what her house was surrounded by. And then Gladys, we had brought a story from the Hobbs paper. They have a site there. I believe they handle chemicals that they sell to the oil and gas companies. And there's been a smell coming from this facility there in Hobbs for the past few months. It's a really fishy, gross odor, and it's making people in the neighborhood sick. And they have associated it with something called a petrosweet chemical. And she thought the smell was just coming from the local animal shelter nearby. And we had brought this story, and she said, oh my gosh, my house is right there. And so we went to her house and, had prayer time and sprinkled holy water there. New Mexico Environment Department is investigating this site, but there's the site right there. It's called Baker Hughes. And you have just the neighborhood right there. That's where Gladys's house was. So that was, quite hard to see how close they're living to all of this and what an impact it's having on their health. But it was good for them to, know that these tools are there, and then also connect with us to know that, there's help for whatever we can do to lower the burden of living near all of these things. From there, and I apologize. From there, we drove back through to Carlsbad. That way everyone could kind of get a look at what I would call the heart of the oil field, and that's between Carlsbad and Hobbs in the Jow, Eunice area. That's where there's a lot of oil and gas production. And so, lands of pump jacks, things like that. And then the next morning, Stephen shared with me a vessel that he had made. He went on a indigenous retreat, and he made this vessel, and I believe, does anyone remember how many there are? There's about 10 or so in circulation, something like that he mentioned.
I was gonna say 10.
No, there's over 50.
Oh, there's over 50. Stephen's here. Okay, do you want to explain a little bit about it, Stephen?
Sure. So the Earth and Treasure-based practice is been, historically connected with the Buddhist tradition. Cynthia Jors, who is located in Tsuke, is the one who has been responsible for bringing the practice to the forefront. And the first generation of vases and the second generation were and are all over the globe in areas that are being affected, environmental degradation, human rights, and the vessels are buried after they've been filled with prayer. And so then at Ghost Ranch, we had a gathering and we began a third generation, and the elders from Santa Clara guided the making of the vessels, and then each of us had prayed about where our vessel would be connected to. And from my first immersion of going down into the Permian Basin, that's what I just felt very called, and the vessel felt like it was called. And so I've had the vessel, but it felt like the vessel needed to be in the area and beginning to find its home. And that's why then that was now passed over, and it's being stewarded there. So
I have it right here with me. And it was a beautiful time when he shared the story of it with us, and we all, prayed over it and put our own thoughts into it. And there's some photos of that. Stephen was gracious enough to leave it in my care. And so here we are exchanging it. And then again, the whole group together. And then from there, we went back out into the oil field. Again, I was able to show everyone some sites, near schools and things like that in Carlsbad. And I was having trouble. Let me pull up some of those pictures. I was having trouble getting them to go into this presentation. But let's see here. This is a live photo, so it looks like a video. It is actually not. But as you can see, you have an oil and gas site right here, and you have an elementary school in the background where I'm circling. There's an elementary school right there. And so I was able to show everyone, some of these sites that are really close to schools, homes, things like that. And then we also were able to drive through and just drive through the oil field and observe. As you all are probably aware, there is a ban on routine venting and flaring in New Mexico. Our environmental agencies do not have adequate funding, so they can't always enforce these rules. And you would also need a small army to cover the Permian Basin, I always say. So everyone was able to see, some of these things out in the oil field that happen every day that are technically illegal. But you will see, lots of flares if you drive around the oil field that look like this, just burning. We call these dirty flares with the smoke coming from them. So everyone was able to, see those things. So that's just a little bit of an overview of our trip. As I mentioned, production here is backed up in the Permian Basin is, one of the most prominent oil fields in the world. So it's really driven by geopolitics and very large forces beyond our control down here. And because of that, Citizens Caring for the Future, we are always advocating for stronger regulations to protect us from the emissions, to protect our water, things like that. We also are working to slow leasing on federal lands, put a stop to that. That's unlikely, but that's something we will be advocating for. But because of the production, and it really seems here to stay for a while, Citizens Caring for the Future is also, taking a much more local approach. So I mentioned the oil and gas threat map. We will be doing a canvassing campaign in these oil and gas threat zones, these neighborhoods, and just notifying people that they live within a half mile and some of the health things that can be associated living near these oil and gas sites. There's not a lot of education for folks down here. As I mentioned, when I started to get worried about environmental issues, I didn't really know where to turn because it's an informational desert in a lot of ways. So notifying people of, the dangers because people are not aware. And then also giving them, real world practical things that they can do. So how do they talk to their doctors? What should they be taking note of? And then also educating doctors here in the region that don't know a lot of the issues that come with living near oil and gas sites. Then we also are hoping to empower people to just make smarter decisions, to take a look at, what the air pollution levels look like before they go outside and, have a barbecue with their family, something like that. Getting air purifiers into their homes for folks that live really close to these sites to make sure that the air indoors is clean. And then also making sure that environmental groups, conservancy groups have more of a upfront place in the communities here in Southeast New Mexico. A lot of our community initiatives are funded and funded by oil and gas majors. And so we're really working to get different funding sources and then also get things into our schools and our community to educate people on climate change and how they can make an impact on making sure that climate change is addressed for future generations, especially here in the Permian, since the emissions here play such a big role in global warming. So that's just a little bit about the trip and what we do as Citizens Caring for the Future. And with that, I will hand it over to Clara, Ann, and Ruth to talk a little bit more about the trip and what they thought of it.
Thank you so much, Keely. And do you want to just stop sharing your screen maybe so we can see everyone's faces a little bit more? Awesome. Thank you so much. Ruth, do you want to start us off just sharing a little bit about our reflections on the trip?
Sure. So Kaylee covered a ton of different things. One of the things that I'd like to highlight is the role of older oil wells that no longer are producing much of anything, but are creating a huge amount of pollution. And the fact that the way the permitting process goes, the state and the entities that permit the wells don't require very much bonding money. So it's very expensive to cap the well, to close it, to clean it up. So they just don't do it. So it just sits there and emits a lot of toxic pollution. So that's one thing I wanted to make sure we mentioned. Another thing is the racist overtones of a lot of this. It it's not a coincidence that the 3 Mexican immigrant women we met live in a neighborhood surrounded by oil infrastructure. And one of them told us, well, several of them, that the water was unsafe to drink and even unsafe to bathe in. And that pretty much blew my mind, because in Albuquerque, you know, we get updates yearly from the water quality control folks telling us all the aspects of what's in our water, and it's just sounded unconscionable. But that was one of my things. We didn't spend a lot of time this retreat talking about produced water, but that's a huge concern, is that when you frack a well, there's a huge volume of liquid that is not oil, many times more than the actual oil, and it's full of toxic chemicals, and they have to figure out what to do with it. You know, you get the good with the bad, and so they end up just dumping it. It's supposed to be injected deep into the earth, but it's just easier and cheaper to find a remote corner and dump it on the ground. So those were my 3 points.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I want to leave time for us to have some question and answer, so I won't talk for very long. Mostly I wanted to uplift an aspect that Ruth already touched on. She said the racial overtones of this issue, and I think that the Permian is such a powerful example of the ways in which we need to cultivate in ourselves and in our groups how we talk about with more fluency how connected climate change and pollution is with forms of racial discrimination, whether that's about living in a particular region and also just living in particular neighborhoods. So as you saw from these photos, there are homes and there are schools right next to these facilities. And one of the things that struck me so powerfully in this trip was to think about this as a public health crisis, which I think it very clearly is from the examples Keely just raised anecdotally about the rates of aggressive cancers, and how that maps onto our national narrative around the relationship between public health crises and environmental pollutants. Cancer Alley in Louisiana is maybe a more nationally well-known example. So it hit me over and over again that this is such a clear connection that's happening in this part of the state, and I had no idea about it, and I live in New Mexico, so how many people across our country know nothing about what's going on down there? So I think that for me, at least, one really tangible thing that I and everyone can do is just speak with the people in your life about this and start sort of connecting those dots, because I think when people hear about climate change and they hear about the politics of oil and gas, that can feel an inaccessible thing to talk about and certainly very politically polarized. But when we start telling these stories of people who don't even want to take a shower because of the quality of water, that's so humanizing, and it's a story that you can tell that I think usually ought to pull at the heartstrings of anyone and get them curious about what's happening. So anyway, I just wanted to uplift especially that piece. Stephen or Anne, do you want to say anything right now? I know that, Anne, you're going to talk a little bit later on about some action items.
I can say just a little bit. So this was my second opportunity to go for this immersion experience. And Ruth really pointed out a number of things that stood out for me. But the other thing that I guess was very interesting, in addition to like these old wells, that, and the statistic I think was that they make up for over 50% of the wells, but the production amount is only like, I mean, over 50% of like the emissions of all the pollutants, but they only generate about 6%. So, you know, it's just like a no-brainer. But the other thing was, when we went the first time, which was pre-COVID, there was just this like chaotic kind of reality. I mean, because everything had just started booming, and, you know, and then when we went this time, there was like this degree of almost normalcy with it. And I don't say that as a positive thing. You know, it was just the reflection that, you know, how often does that become the case, that we begin to think that, oh, well, this is just normal. This is the way it's supposed to be. And the people that live there, you know, they see these wells, they see the flares, they know that you know, there's this beautiful park in Carlsbad, but can you really go out and safely be in it? But that's just kind of like, well, we accept that now, that just goes with living there. And that really was difficult for me to hold and to think about, that this is not supposed to be normal. So I guess that's my little piece that I'd like to add.
Thank you, Stephen. Anne, do you want to say anything before we move to some Q&A?
And you're muted.
You're muted.
Thanks. I just want to underscore how shocking it was to drive through this area and both see the incredible density of the oil and gas production. And here we were there for maybe 36 hours, experiencing, just in our time, mostly driving in cars, the number of us who had headaches and felt nauseous, just from being in the area, breathing the air. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of the emotional impact of recognizing what a sacrifice zone this is for the nation and the world, that we're pulling all this oil and gas out of there, you know, at the expense of the whole region, the people, the critters, the landscape. So I have lots of things to say about what we need to do. So I'll hold the rest of my comments.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we want to open it up now for a little while, just to give folks time to respond and ask any questions that you have. I know this might be a lot of really new information for some people, so I think the floor is open. And I think Steffi, maybe you already had a question that you asked in the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know, Kaylee, if you want to answer that. But...
I can address that. So Steffi's question was, do we have enough particle, benzene, VOC, NOx detectors in Eddy and Lee County and the surrounding counties? So the answer to that question is absolutely not. And this is something that I was shocked to learn when I started learning about the oil and gas industry and how well regulated it is. I always assumed if we have all of this production around, then there is a lot of regulation going on and a lot of monitoring going on, right? A lot of environmental monitoring. I think partly that was because I had kind of a false trust in our regulatory agencies and the government, things like that. But also I've grown up near WIP. I mean, WIP is also in Carlsbad, and WIP is very, very heavily regulated and very well monitored. And so I just assumed that every industry kind of operated in that way. So the answer to that question is we actually do not have any monitors that monitor those specific pollutants, specifically the ones that hurt human health, the VOCs. So your benzene, it's called the BTEC suite of pollutants, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. We do not have any monitors that are monitoring any of that. And those are the primary pollutants coming from the oil and gas industry. That is because under the Clean Air Act, states are only required to monitor ozone levels and VOCs are what we call ozone precursors. So the VOCs are emitted, they interact with sunlight and create ozone. So we are not monitoring those specific pollutants, but what they create, which is ozone. Citizens Caring for the Future has been really worried about this issue for a long time. And so we actually have been working with the New Mexico Environment Department. They entered a grant competition on our behalf just a few months ago to get funding from the EPA to implement an air monitor that will live with the ozone monitor in Eddy County, and it will monitor the BTEC suite of pollutants, which I mentioned are the main VOCs coming from oil and gas, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. We'll find out soon if they were awarded that grant. But yeah, it is kind of wild that we do not monitor the pollutants that hurt human health. And you would think there is a lot more monitoring, but there is not. There is only one ozone monitor in Eddy County, and there's also one in Lee County. These are both run by the New Mexico Environment Department. I did kind of lie. There is another one in Eddy County that is ran by the National Park Service. It's at Carlsbad Caverns, and that is why we actually have it here. But those are the only ones in this whole region. In the most active oil and gas basin in the country, actually in the world, some would say, those are your only ozone air monitors. And the one in Carlsbad is quite off the beaten path. It is not in the middle of the oil and gas fields. So that's just to answer that question.
Melanie, or I don't know if you're Melanie, but raise hand, please. Please.
Melanie and Tom, sorry.
But Tom has it's probably more of a comment than a question, or could be a question, I guess. The United Church of Christ and its disaster response coordination and teams have the commitment to respond to technological or human-caused disasters. Have you touched into the national church for any kind of funding or grants? Or then this, I guess the secondary question is, maybe it's more of a statement. Let's get them involved. They want to know about these things.
And this is, you said, the national churches, or?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it just happens that I'm the New Mexico representative for the Southwest Conference to the disaster response team.
Oh, great.
So
Perfect.
let's do something to
Yeah.
pull not only attention, but maybe some funding into our area.
We would love that.
Tom, can you share your contact info in the chat so that?
And just so everyone has it, I will share my contact info as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not good at that. Melanie will do that.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Mark. What state and federal agencies are actively, regulating the water and air issues with this industry?
Well, you do for air issues, the New Mexico Environment Department and the Oil Conservation Division are regulating the air along with the EPA. I believe in terms of regulating water that the New Mexico Environment Department is regulating it here in New Mexico. There's not a lot in the way of regulation, and then enforcing it here in the oil field is a whole different story. We do have a law that, you cannot dump produced water here in New Mexico, but if you have been to the Permian Basin, you see how vast it is, how much of it is in the middle of nowhere. There is really little to no enforcement of that rule. And I do not know much about water, and probably might be able to answer more of this question.
Unfortunately, I don't have my arms around the degree to which the New Mexico Environment Department is doing any water quality monitoring around oil and gas production.
Yeah, but they would be the ones doing that regulation from the state level. And federal, I assume it would be EPA as well. Yes, Pat's question, You remember when fracking came to our attention, there was a request to find out the chemicals used in that process, but the companies claimed propriety. Did we ever find out the answer? There is, there is some knowledge about what is in the water that is used in the oil and gas industry, high levels of PFAs, so forever chemicals. Colorado did just pass a rule that they will be required to disclose what is in the fracking fluid there. But New Mexico specifically does not have a law that requires them to disclose what is in the fluid, and there is no federal framework either. I believe we'll probably find out a lot more about what's in fracking fluid from Colorado's rule. And although it is different, what is in each water, all the water that they use, it is different for each basin because of the nature of the rock. But I do assume that we will probably find out quite a bit more about what is in the water from there. So that's something that hopefully in New Mexico, I don't think it's coming up this legislative session, but something we can hopefully take care of in the next few years to come would be my hope.
Thank you. Atkins, why don't you ask your question, and then let's move to some of the broad what can we do from Kaylee and Ann, since I'm sure that's a question for everyone.
I have two questions. My name is Henry Atkins. I coordinate the Laudato Si Action Committee for the Franciscans at Holy Cross Friary and Retreat Center here in Mesilla, New Mexico. First question is environmental racism, as you know, is prevalent all across the US. And you look at Houston, the 5th Ward, primarily Black ward, has more toxic dumps. The area around Newark, New Jersey is Cancer Alley, etc. Very often lawsuits have been brought against companies that pollute. You don't often win, but one of the things that happens is you get an incredible amount of publicity, and it's a very quick way to educate. And I was wondering if any legal action had been brought in the Permian Basin. The second question I have is sort of like the first, is are any of the church communities in your area involved in any way in the ecological struggle in any significant way? And again, I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and thank you all guys. Thank you all for being here today. In terms of environmental racism lawsuits, I don't believe there's been anything taken up, on those kinds of claims before. There is, legal action being taken on permitting issues, oil and gas leasing and permitting. But in terms of environmental racism, there has not been a case of that nature to my knowledge. I do think that's an interesting avenue that is worth looking into. I will say we have a lot of hesitancy with people being willing to speak out really in any way, much less take aggressive action, such as filing a lawsuit. That is because of the political nature of this region. It's, as I mentioned, we're the only advocacy group in the area, extremely red. And in the past, specifically, I would say 4 years, it's gotten more and more extreme. And so there is a real hesitancy for people to, take that kind of action because of the possible dangers that it could come with. But then also a lot of folks work in the oil and gas industry. That's the main source of well-paying jobs here at the moment. I mean, that changes obviously, and so that's where I think we might run into issues with that, but that's something that I would like to look into as time goes on. And if we ever find people that are interested in doing that kind of thing, I think that's an important avenue. Because as you said, it raises awareness in a lot of ways. I went to Washington, D.C. back in the fall for a climate protest event. And so it's a lot of people there that are very engaged in climate action and in the climate crisis. And I was slated to speak one day, and the night before we had kind of a rehearsal of sorts. And they had all the speakers for the next day stand up, and they introduced me. And I sat back down, and there was a group of 4 people behind me, and they tapped me on the shoulder and they said, "What's the Permian Basin? We've never heard of that." And we're the most active oil and gas basin essentially in the world. You know, we emit the most methane of anywhere else in the country, which is, you know, 4 to 8 times stronger than carbon dioxide and warming the planet. So that was kind of crazy, and there needs to be a lot more publicity around, you know, what a problem the Permian Basin is. Just not in the fact that, I mean, frontline communities, we are obviously severely impacted, but failure to cut emissions in this region will have a grave impact for the world over, essentially. And then your other question was, are there churches engaged? So we do, we have a lot of faith leaders that are in leadership and citizens caring for the future. It's kind of funny, their churches aren't super particularly engaged, but we do have churches, you know, doing things like getting solar panels at their church and changing to more sustainable energy sources and stuff like that. But we don't have any churches, you know, outwardly engaged with, I can't remember the term you used. I've heard it a lot. Something about creation. I'm not sure, but we do not have many churches engaged. Most of the churches here would not be willing to engage. We work hard to get the ones that we think are open to us to engage with us more. But that's something that is kind of a constant evolving thing that we're always working on and trying to get them more engaged in this region.
Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. Maybe, Anne, do you want to start with some of the action steps?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to underscore something you said, Clara, about I think a huge action step is to talk about the Permian Basin with friends, family, wherever, because Kaylee just underscored, you know, people don't know for the most part, even here in New Mexico, what the nature of the sacrifice zone and how much need there is for regulation and enforcement of regulation and the ongoing hope that there could be some shift to renewables. So this, beyond those conversations, I just want to emphasize that given that we have this information from the oil and gas threat map, that one important thing is to lobby for and ask for setbacks, better setbacks for the, and as I understood, Kaylee, and maybe we don't know for sure, maybe in Hobbs, where we spoke with the women whose families are in the oil and gas industry production, there maybe are no setback requirements in Hobbs as a municipality. So if there was something at the state level, maybe that could be then required for some of these cities in the Southeast region.
And there will be something on the state level, just so everyone knows. That is in the works. There will be something on the state level. It'll be a part of the Oil and Gas Reform Act, although I've heard another name floated, so that might not be the official name. It will be built into that act, setback requirements statewide. And so that's something to advocate for in this upcoming legislative session. When we get more information, I'm sure it will be shared with you. Sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that when you were still on it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then whatever methane rules strengthening can happen either at the federal or state level is absolutely critical. And Ruth and Clara asked me to speak to the work we've done in Valencia County. We've had this shocking development in our county, and if for everyone, that's the county just below Albuquerque's Bernalillo County. No oil and gas production here. We've had a push by an oil and gas magnate to create easier and less costly avenue for doing oil and gas production in our county, which a group of little citizens group fought tooth and nail with a lot of help from a lot of environmental groups. The ordinance that was passed in our county is called the Natural Resources Overlay Zone, or NROZ. And so we would just love to have anyone's help when it comes to it was approved with some better criteria, but it was approved, and we anticipate there'll be applications for oil and gas production permits in our county. And we'd love to have support from everyone to show up at Planning and Zoning Commission meetings and County Commission meetings here in Valencia County as needed. And Claire, I have lots of other ideas, but I think we want to hear from Kaylee, who's more in the know.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Oh, Mike, did you have a question before we move on? Sorry.
Yes, Kaylee, have you visited, or what would be your Mayor Dale Janaway's position on these issues?
You know, I have tried to engage with him before, just to kind of, I believe what I tried to get him to do was to come out with earthworks to see the pollution through the thermography camera, the FLIR video camera. This was probably about a year and a half ago. It was around the time I first started. There is a lot of hesitancy. Well, I would say, you know, there's absolutely no interest from local government here to question the oil and gas industry whatsoever. Our city and our county both work very closely with a mega lobbying firm called FTI Consulting that works with, you know, the likes of Exxon, Chevron, things like that. So it is very hard to get city leaders to engage. There's some city council people that I have good relationships with, always trying to keep those lines of communication open, but there is not very much, shall we say, openness to even learning about the risk that come with living near all of this. And, you know, what we need to do to make sure that where we live isn't completely destroyed, so that when inevitably the markets change and there's not as much demand for oil and gas, we're not left behind with all of this mess and no economy to turn to, because we've been the engine of oil and gas as it's taking its last 9 breaths. So there doesn't seem to be any of that forward thinking on a local leadership level. And I haven't got to really talk to him about it all that much.
Would Kaylee, would this be the same reason, for example, that Dale Janaway, the Chamber of Commerce, the religious and faith and spiritual organizations, would this be the same reason they do not want to get involved? I heard you mention them, but I didn't get a kind of a sense of your relationship, or if anyone in the various and sundry spiritual denominations of Hobbes, Artesia, Carlsbad were involved.
Yeah. So, you know, I think the hesitancy for the local governments, then the chambers as well, to engage, a lot of it is funding. For city officials and stuff, so much of our economy is run by oil and gas that they just, you know, see no need to look elsewhere. The chamber and a lot of just local organizations working on all sorts of different issues, they receive the bulk of their funding from oil and gas. And so are the bulk of their membership in terms of the chamber from oil and gas companies. So I think that's a big part of the hesitancy. And then in terms of faith communities, I don't think they're not getting as much funding from oil and gas companies. But as I mentioned, there is quite a bit of extremism here. And so just really politics plays a huge role in it at this point in time. When I grew up here, everyone was a lot more balanced. There was not quite as polarizing and extreme. But now, you know, you can't really question much of anything. and you're either, you know, a Republican or you're either a Democrat, and, you know, there's no openness in terms of listening or talking about these issues. And I think a lot of the times a lot of the churches here can fall into, you know, more of an extreme place. But then also in terms of, like, for instance, we've tried to connect with the Methodist Church in the past, I believe in Hobbs, and we were told that, you know, they have legislator that it's part of the church that said, oh no, you know, you cannot speak to these people, stuff like that. So a lot of it is just local folks, word of mouth, saying, no, this is something we don't question, and you can't be involved with this kind of thing, to just kind of give an overview. And so that's something that we've dealt with quite a bit. And I'm from here, and I know a lot of these people, and they're people I've been raised around, and there's just no willingness to engage on this specific issue.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
A little bit, well, it's in town, but a little bit south, there is this big hole. This big hole that is several hundred feet deep. It's next to a trailer park and near a canal. Are you familiar with that?
The sinkhole?
I think that's what you would call it.
Yeah, I have heard, I've never gone to see it before, but I have heard of it. And you're correct. It's like, I want to say it's maybe somewhere near Lovington, possibly. It's maybe in that vicinity. I'm not very familiar with it. I'm familiar with the bigger one south of town here that actually there never was. That might be the one you're talking about. It never actually sunk in, but then they had to refill it and restabilize it. And that project has been done.
Have they filled it in?
They have filled it in, and it is now officially done, and there are no longer signs that say you're over a sinkhole at the moment. There used to be signs going up to it that would say, you know, in 1,000 feet, beware potential sinkhole. There's a traffic light right on top of it. And I always hated going that direction because it would scare me. My hands would sweat. But that is actually filled up now. The state did fix it. And
Did oil and gas cause that?
So I do believe it was an oil and gas company, but it was way back in, you know, the 80s, this particular company, and then they went belly up. And so that's why they did not pay to fix it. Now that's something that could happen nowadays as well, even worse. Some fracking causes even more potential for sinkholes, and, you know, how we're re-injecting the waste, that's also causing problems. The difference is it's much less likely to be in the middle of town. That was back in the 80s, that was allowed, that was permitted. They got a permit to do it that close to town. And that's why that one made so much news, because, you know, there's a business on top of it that had to close. There was houses. So nowadays you're likely to have that happen just out in the middle of the desert. And so, which is all not good by any means. And I don't think they know nearly as much as they need to about what an impact all of this can have geologically. In terms of sinkholes, earthquakes, you know, our water, the caverns. There was just an earthquake about 4 miles south of the caverns, and it was a 4.5. This happened just a few days ago. So I don't think they know nearly enough about the risk that comes with all of this. And then, you know, you have talks of things like carbon sequestration now, where we're going to inject carbon back into the ground. Don't know much about the impacts that'll have. So that is something that is, you know, very scary, and there urgently needs to be more research done on that topic.
Thank you, Mike, and everyone for your questions. I want to make sure we respect our time here, or just a little bit over. Nancy, do you want to wrap us up with a final question, and then we can close?
Steffi had a question in the chat also.
Oh. I mute myself.
You're muted.
For all this time, we get this down, but no. So I have been lucky enough to be in your area before the pandemic with earthworks. So I've been down there and seen, you know, look through those floor cameras and talk to people whose lives have been destroyed by what's going on down there. And I just want to sort of emphasize for people who haven't gone, you should try to go, because it is not just a little well here and there. This is mega industrial processes going on everywhere, and that land will never be able to be used, honestly, for anything again. I mean, it is on a scale that is barely imaginable. So that's just my background. So I wanted to just mention a few things about somebody, I think Dodie asked about setbacks, which is just a rule that says that a well has to be, can't be within a certain distance, prescribed distance from a school, a home, et cetera, et cetera. And that is definitely something that needs to be done. The other thing, just the air monitoring, I bet everybody on this call has been in legislative hearings where they've heard representatives from Hobbs and Carlsbad say, what bad air? We have great air here in Carlsbad. I mean, I have literally heard them say this. And so air monitoring, just to prove that that's not true, is definitely seems like a really big priority in this work of sort of next things to do. And then the last one is, I have a little, because I was a kindergarten teacher for many years, I have a show and tell. In today's Albuquerque Journal, there is a letter to an op-ed from Jim Winchester, Executive Director of the Independent Petroleum Association, Mexico, decrying the fact that New Mexico's methane rule is unfair on low producing wells. And it just, I mean, the facts that you just gave, Kelly, about, you know, the fact that they produce much more pollution than they do oil or gas is just, I mean, this whole, you should see this editorial. You will immediately become upset because they're saying how unfair this is, that they're picking on these little wells that are hardly making these poor producers any money. Never mentions the statistics that you gave about, you know, them producing 50% of the pollution and 6% of the product. So it's just, seems like those three areas are really critical. So I'd just like to hear if, you know, what other ideas you all have about that.
Yeah. So in terms of that, yeah, the Independent Petroleum Association does have a lawsuit against these rules, as I'm sure what you saw in that op-ed. I will say that I have heard that it's not too strong of a case for them. So hopefully, you know, that doesn't have much of a bearing on anything. But yeah, you hear that a lot. You know, if we're regulated whatsoever, then we're going to go belly up. And that is just, at the end of the day, you know, all these other industries work with much tighter regulations than the oil and gas industry. And that's something that in the past few years I've been working. I just find incredible that quite literally every other industry has such stringent environmental regulations that they must abide by. And then you have the oil and gas industry that has, you know, little to no regulation. And it is, you know, just absolutely incredible. So I agree. The monitoring to really prove that it is bad air quality, but then also the EPA right now is investigating whether or not to declare the Permian Basin as a whole, so Texas and New Mexico, the whole region, they're going to possibly declare it a non-attainment zone based on ozone pollution. So that means we've had a certain number of days where the ozone level, you know, exceeds healthy standards set by the EPA. And if we do get designated a non-attainment zone, then a lot of more funding comes in and the EPA will be doing a lot more oversight, a lot more monitoring comes into play. So while it's ultimately quite depressing that we're at that point, it's actually really exciting news that we may get, you know, more of the oversight that we need. As I mentioned, it would take a small army to regulate the whole Permian Basin. It's thousands upon thousands of wells. And, you know, the New Mexico Environment Department doesn't have a single air inspector even living in this region. And I believe the stat is there is one inspector per every 18,000 wells in the state of New Mexico, something like that. So that's just, you know, absolutely terrifying. So something we can really do is advocate for funding for our regulatory agencies. That's a real biggie. And then as this non-attainment zone thing with EPA gets rolling, there will be more advocacy to do around that. And that is really important. And so we will keep everyone updated on what you can do. But that's a really big thing that, you know, might have a major impact on the level of emissions here. I did see another, one more question from Steffi. Is anyone doing any study to quantify how much venting and flaring is still going on? I know Environmental Defense Fund and stuff, they do quite a bit of studies. I don't know if they're doing ones trying to track how much venting and flaring is going on or not. The trouble with that is a lot of those studies depend on these oil and gas companies self-reporting. And time again, we have learned through regulation and all sorts of, you know, regulation studies, things like that, that anything that depends on the oil and gas companies self-reporting is really not all that accurate. So those studies are being done. I am one of the people that's always like, oh, nope, it's much worse than that, because I live here and, you know, driving around, things like that. So that's just a little bit on that. I do want to, I know we're going to try to get done here in the next few minutes. So just a few more actions that I haven't already brought up. As I mentioned, the non-attainment zone, advocating for funding for regulatory agencies. That is really, really a big thing, especially here in New Mexico. There will be a new EPA supplemental rule coming out soon that we're hoping bans routine venting and flaring federally. We'll see if that actually happens, and we're hoping that it includes more frequent inspections at lower producing sites, especially close to schools and homes. That should be coming out hopefully within the next week. I also mentioned supporting the Oil and Gas Reform Act this upcoming legislative session. That's something else that folks can do here in New Mexico that is very helpful. That will focus not only on setbacks, but, you know, the Environmental Improvement Board, I believe it'll change the makeup of that, and it will address bonding. There's a few different things. I haven't been able to see a draft yet. As I said, I'm not sure what the name is even. I think it has changed, but that's something that folks can really work on. And then I think something else that, you know, just in general for folks to do is really to stay up to date on the different tactics that oil and gas are using at this point. They've really pivoted from denying climate change to saying climate change is here and we're a part of the solution. Here is how, let us drive the train. And you're seeing that things like carbon capture, you know, fight hard against any kind of investment in carbon capture technologies, which have not been proven whatsoever. There's not been one carbon capture plant that has actually worked. So, you know, that's not only more emissions in our air justified by carbon capture, but also could become a stranded asset. So just not good business at the end of the day. Things like blue hydrogen, that has a big carbon footprint. You have to have methane that props up the oil and gas industry. So just really keeping up to date on kind of the buzzwords that they're using, the buzz technologies that they're using, and just talking about how important it is that we fight against that. And then I also would say oil and gas leasing, really advocating for a managed decline that begins with no oil and gas leasing on federal lands. Obviously that's still happening, but just knowing that part of the solution is not adding on to the problem as we continue to add on to the problem. And just being aware that we cannot truly cut emissions without toning down oil and gas production. Just the scale of the problem is too large at this point, and the scale of the Permian especially is too large. So that's something that I would also say, advocating on behalf of that. And also keep up to date on the permitting reforms that will be happening on a federal level. I don't know much about what that bill is going to look like. That was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, though, is permitting reform, which is very necessary to permit renewable projects. That's actually badly needed so that we can have a really great build out. But just in whatever circle you're in, making sure to stay attuned to what issues can come with permitting reform and how much easier oil and gas permitting can happen because of these reforms. So that's another thing that I would say to just stay on top of. But that's all that's coming to mind. Also, just on a personal level, if you all just ever want to reach out to me with questions, that would be absolutely wonderful. And then I'm always looking to, you know, possibly start programs in this area, in our schools, things like that. And just connecting Southeast New Mexico with the rest of New Mexico. And there's so many wonderful things going on in Northern New Mexico and the rest of the state, and just getting us connected and engaged with what you all are doing is always something that I'm looking to do, and I think would be great for this region.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, for just the breadth and depth of everything that you've shared here today, and for everyone for taking the time to be here. This is clearly such important work and on such a huge magnitude that I know that we will be hearing about it more in the future, both from Kaylee and from our various church circles and advocacy communities. So I just want to say my profound thanks for everyone for being here, and I'm just going to close this out with a very short blessing. So if you join me for a moment in the spirit of prayer and blessing. Holy mystery, earth and air and water are your creation, and everything created is precious and essential. Help us live in ways that honor and dignify all people and places. Help us redeem and heal our life ways of harm, and guide us toward new ways of being and truer ways of honoring this precious life we have been given for the flourishing and dignity of all. We pray this in your many holy names. Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. And again, we recorded this session, so we'll be sharing it with you all.
And my contact info is, I shared it in the chat, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.